Hello again, and welcome to the Editor's Table. This is Troy Norton. I'm Chris Banger Drowns. Today our discussion is going to be about education reform in the public school system. We're going to put this video up on ahsthenest.com, so you guys can watch it there. Just go check that out. We'll let you know when it's up. Also, if you have any suggestions as to this topic here or further topics that could be addressed, please send them to ahsthenest@gmail.com. Sure.
And of course, always feel free to leave us a comment letting us know what you think or any ideas for future segments or stories you want on the Nest. Now, as for the topic at hand, our topic this week is going to be public school reform, which is a pretty heated issue, especially in the climate of all of the changes taking place in statewide and nationwide, as far as the different bills and such being put forth. And what were your opinions on some of this?
On the bill specifically, I'm in general not in favor of either Obama's Race to the Top, nor am I in favor of Bush's No Child Left Behind, simply because they test too much.
Right.
And I mean, first off the bat, I should say, I don't think testing is a bad idea. Obviously, there are benefits to testing, but
there's a way of going about it.
Exactly, and there's an issue when you over-test kids. You're wasting class time, and you're creating a sort of arbitrary feeling about it where there's no creativity involved in a test. It's mostly, or there can be, but the way we are tested, there's no creativity in it.
Right, exactly. It's sort of just standardized test after standardized test. We even see that here to some extent with the pre-tests and the post-tests. And to a large extent, that takes away from a lot of what the teachers want to do with their time. It buys into their time, into their instruction. They're forced to teach basically to the tests and not to their own material, which I think is a pretty big issue for teachers and students alike.
Right. That being said, obviously, if you allow teachers to teach in their own style, that won't solve every problem, because some teachers may not foster creativity in their students. They may stick with the old way of doing things simply because that's how they know to do it, or simply because they think that's how it should work. And personally, I feel that there's not much connection between the students and the teachers in terms of input in how the class should be taught. And that also goes for teacher communication with administrators and so on up the chain. And there seems to be, going all the way to the federal level, obviously, with these policies. And I think the issue is that you have politicians and non-teachers, essentially, and people who haven't been students for decades, creating policies that shape the life of students and teachers, which seems a bit odd and absurd to me.
Yeah, I agree about the communication that needs to take place between especially the teachers and the students. And I don't think that's exclusive by any means to the high school level. I think it starts in middle school and even at the elementary school level. I think the primary job of the teacher is to instill a value of education into the students. And by the time we reach high school, it's very difficult to try and work that into a student's mind frame. It's difficult to make him, at that point, firmly invested in the educational process. It's something that has to happen at the earlier levels.
Definitely. I mean, I don't personally remember many experiences from preschool or kindergarten simply because that was so long ago. But I do know for a fact that reading and math, at the very least, should be the two subjects that are pushed and given. Kids should be given a love to learn those two subjects, because those two are so integral to our society, especially mathematics these days, with engineering and sciences booming at such a large rate. And I think when many kids see reading, and especially mathematics more than reading, they think of very structured sort of learning process. They don't see it as being creative. They don't see it as being abstract, which is
really it's anything but.
Exactly. I mean, I think the problem is that the way we're being taught mathematics, it's not practical. It's merely theoretical in many of the cases. So we're not being, at a very simplistic level, we're not being taught 2 + 2, or we are being taught 2 + 2 = 4, but we're not being taught that 2 apples plus 2 pints of sugar equals a pie or something like that,
That's
which would be
true.
much more interesting to a younger child.
Right, exactly. To see what they can get out of it. And I think that's also something that teachers have to keep in mind, how they can firmly engage the student in the material being taught, and also present the opportunities available to them with these skills. You mentioned all the emerging fields available to people, and these are going to only extrapolate more and more as time goes by. So by the time, say, the students who are in younger levels right now are our age, then there presumably will be even more opportunities available to them, and we need to tell them, this is what you can do with these skills, this is what you can make of your life.
Right, and we have the STEM program sort of going over, that term STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. And obviously, you need to engage students in that curriculum. It's integral to society and to progress. But the way it's being taught is not engaging enough for any kid. And also, this goes back to the testing issue, is that intelligence is being measured in a way that doesn't account for all the types of intelligence that kids have. We, at least many of us, most of us, I think, have a tendency to shy away from very rigid structures, just the most of us. Obviously some people don't do that, but mostly that's the nature of kids, to shy away from a rigid structure. We want freedom, we want abstraction. And the way we're being taught is exactly the opposite of that. And so with the STEM program, if you're trying to push kids into science, technology, engineering, and math, you should be teaching those abstractly and not in a rigid format. Instead of saying, here's the formula for a slope, memorize it, go outside, build a potato cannon and measure the height and the slope of it. Obviously it'll take more time, but you know for a fact that when you get to the end of the year, you're going to remember firing a potato cannon.
Exactly, you can't forget that.
Exactly, it's a phenomenal experience. And measuring the slope and such, there's no way you'll forget that. That concept will be stuck in your mind for decades to come. And not only will that happen, not only will you learn the concept, but it will foster the love of science and of math and of engineering, which is needed, it's integral if you want to put that kid into the sciences.
It is, exactly, and there's something to be said about a potato cannon versus just handing a kid a packet to read. Recently in the news there was a story about a kid who got fed up with that sort of teaching and promptly walked out of class and made a bit of a scene about it. But this kid was actually pretty admired for what he did, for essentially standing up to what may be a system that needs to be fixed, for calling out these problems. And it might not have been the best way of going about it per se, but he's calling attention to an issue that demands our full investment. And that's what we need to do at this point.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier about the communication between the students and the teachers. I think if there was a clear channel of communication, not only of discourse, of talking between the two, but actual input from the students in how the class should be taught and what concepts should be learned in the class, you won't have the issues of packets being thrown at kids and expected to be done, or packets not being thrown at kids because they're supposedly too bad to do work or anything, which happens all too often. So there is definitely a misunderstanding, at the very least, between teachers and students in many cases. And I think if you open up clear channels of communication between the two, that'll help foster a better learning environment.
Right, I agree, and you brought up a pretty interesting point as to throwing a packet at a student or not throwing a packet based on the idea that this student won't do the work, which is something I think we have all seen at some point in our educational careers, and I think that's the entirely wrong way of going about this sort of thing. Mm-hmm. You don't want to limit the kid in any way. You don't want to stigmatize the kid by saying, oh no, you're not going to do this, why am I going to bother? Because all that does is give the kid the idea that, okay, I'm good for nothing and that's how my life is going to be, so why don't I get into some trouble, and then one thing turns into another and then that kid has lost his way, which is a huge problem. So I think the teachers need to keep in mind that they may very well be all the students have. They need to keep in mind that they may be the only resource available to the students, and they may be the only thing keeping the student determining whether the student creates a successful future for himself or a less successful future.
Right, fair enough. And I think a lot of these kids don't, obviously, like you said, they don't have a clear set background, and so having teachers not admire or yeah, I guess admire their characteristics, and I think a lot of teachers don't actually see the intelligence in a lot of kids. They see grades, and they're so exhausted from their other work that they don't want to see it in many cases, or are unable to see it. And I think I mentioned in our last conversation about gun rights the need for a collective struggle of some sort against the gun culture. And I think the same goes for this, where you need some sort of collective struggle against the contradictions and the hypocrisy in this system, because it is a structural problem. Innately is a structural problem. Obviously there are individual issues with certain teachers and certain kids, but those can be solved at an individual basis.
Exactly.
But there needs to be some sort of collective movement towards reforming, even radicalizing this education system, because it's so backwards in many ways. And what I've thought is that you have a certain level of exhaustion amongst teachers and amongst students, both physical and mental. And there's a short distance between exhaustion and frustration. And obviously many have crossed that line, which leads to school shootings and many other obviously tragic things, because there is also a distance between frustration and anger. And I think what needs to happen is, as this frustration is already turned into anger, you need to mold this into anger against the system itself. We need to utilize that and turn that into the collective struggle that solves the issue. Because I think right now, instead of forcing backwards and throwing money and throwing broad policy decisions at schools, is not solving anything. It's merely fostering that movement from exhaustion into frustration and into anger, and into this case, loose anger that kind of leads to fights in schools and drug deals and a lot of other random things that should not be happening.
As opposed to constructive anger, using that to try and improve the system as it is right now.
Yes.
Right. As you can see, this is clearly a very multifaceted issue, and we would love to hear your opinions and your input on this. We're going to leave a space for comments below, and we would love to hear from you there. As always, feel free to send us an email, ahsthenest@gmail.com, and keep checking back to see our next editions of the Editor's Table and whatever news we have to bring to you. Thank you for watching.